Good morning, everyone. I am John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff, Kennedy's Man to Smash the CIA. La CIA, as our Spanish-speaking friends call it. And, well, this morning I wanted to do some reading. I feel like talking about politics and things on my mind this morning is something I've been doing a lot too much to really have anything fresh and new for you on politics this morning. I think I'll do a minefields tonight instead of this morning, so that gives me the day to see what happens and maybe think about what's appropriate for a minefield show tonight. I'm checking my audio here. Excuse me a second. I think I'll just lift it up a little bit. All right. Yeah, that's about where I want it. Okay, forgive the technical interruption there. We're going to get back into The Strength of the Wolf by Douglas Valentine this morning. And good morning to each and every one of you who's joining me here on my backup channel, which is now my main channel. It's called McDuff_2020. And I think by habit I actually introduced myself as being on my old channel, which is gone now. Let's get back into the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and what was happening in 1960, because this is the time when my father was attacked with the hepatitis, and this is the time when he transfers in 62 to the Joint Chiefs of Staff at SACSA. So we were talking about MK Ultra and George White, this crazy man that was given a complete authority over dosing people surreptitiously with LSD just for the sake of testing to see what happens with unsuspecting people. And I think that developed in the 50s into a way to attack people and hurt people's credibility as well as people's ability to function in life. And I do believe that that type of attack was launched on my father to weaken him, to make him less credible, and to destroy his family life, which was something I lived through, and it's something that you never forget. So anyway, what is important that we're learning here is that the CIA has a cutout in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics that they can just tell George White or some of these other folks what they need done, and he goes out and does it. And it doesn't really matter how immoral or illegal or evil it is. Hey, welcome, Detroit. Glad to have you here. So, just to recap, as the Kennedys burst upon the scene, the CIA had turned the FBN completely upside down. CIA agents were blackmailing spies, diplomats, and politicians at 3 bureau safe houses. With the support of complicit FBN agents, the CIA was hiring Corsican drug smugglers as assassins and using mafiosi to smuggle MK Ultra poisons into Cuba in an attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro. On behalf of the agency, FBN headquarters focused public attention on the phantom Chinese communist to Cuban connection, even going so far as explained in the previous chapter as to allow top members of a Kuomintang drug smuggling ring in San Francisco to escape punishment, while George White covered for them by telling the press that the heroin had come from communist China. Meanwhile, the CIA's anti-Castro terrorists were smuggling spies and assassins into Cuba and returning with shiploads of narcotics for sale in America. And the United States had conceded defeat in its war on drugs. Hello, Guillermo. It's FBN is the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And Federal Bureau of Narcotics is the place where the infamous Harry Anslinger was the commissioner for about 30 years. And he's the guy that was responsible for the anti-marijuana campaign, reefer madness and all of that propaganda, busting people for small amounts of pot and low-level heroin users instead of going after the dealers, because the dealers were all working with the CIA. And that's what we find out from this book, among many other things. So it's the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a out-of-control agency being used by the CIA for its own purposes, and that includes the things I've talked about. Excuse me a second. Okay, we're at chapter 16 in the book on page 245, Making the Mafia. Quote, "He who laughs last never really got the joke," unquote. On the 21st of October 1960, FBN agents and detectives from the Westchester County Sheriff's Office arrested Salvatore Rinaldo and Matteo Palmieri for possession of 10 kilograms of high-grade heroin. While the case did not receive the same sensational headlines as L'Affaire Rosal, which involved the seizure of 100 kilograms of heroin and the arrest of an ambassador, the ramifications of the Rinaldo Palmieri case were equally important, leading to the arrest of dozens of drug traffickers in Italy and America, and indirectly to the death of Lucky Luciano. The Rinaldo Palmieri case also brought Agent Frank Selvaggi into the limelight. Tall, edgy, and tragically hip, Selvaggi rivaled Lenny Schreier as the premier case-making agent of their era. During the course of his 9-year career, Selvaggi took into custody dozens of the most dangerous drug traffickers in America, many of whom he bruised and bullied while managing their passage from predator to prisoner. Belligerent when necessary, always astute, he knew how to be charitable, pleasant, and cool, very cool. When he walks, with one hand in his blazer pocket and the other holding a cigarette, it's as if he were shuffling to a Tony Bennett tune. Frank Selvaggi was not someone to trifle with, but to his friends he was a reliable and eminently likable man. Frank was a great raconteur, George Gaffney says with unabashed affection. He spoke in the authentic idiom of the mafia, and he could tell a fabulous story. Sitting for hours on a stakeout with Frank passed by in a minute. Customs agents would come to the office and sit around him like little kids when he told stories about the mafia hoods he knew. He was a true hero, Gaffney adds with emotion. The greatest agent the Bureau ever had. No man made a greater contribution. I wanted to give him the Treasury Medal, but instead he got the rawest deal of any man I've seen. Tragically hip indeed, a perpetual worrier, at times manic, Selvaggi grew up in the same Pelham Bay section of the Bronx as Charlie Siragusa's younger brother. I'm just going to stop for a second because when I see the Pelham of New York, which is an old district of New York close to Manhattan, I think of Pelham Bar because That's where he got his name Pelham from. It's not an old English name. So just one of the little tidbits that I pick up as we study these characters, and Donald Pelham Barr is one of them. William Pelham Barr is another one. Well, sorry for the diversion there. I went to high school with Charlie's niece, Salvaggi, Charlie Siragusa's niece, he explains, and after I graduated from the Maritime Academy, I asked her to marry me. But the Siragusas were old-fashioned Sicilians, and you know what that means. I had to have $25,000 in the bank to get permission, and it took 2.5 years to scrape it together. The marriage was fine, but Frank's wife was lonely, and the kids needed to see their seafaring father more often, so Charlie Siragusa, as a favor for his brother, offered Frank a job with the FBN. I'd done Charlie a favor a few years earlier, Salvaggi explains. I was on an American export line ship, and he asked me to keep an eye out on a particular voyage. When we went into port in Marseille, I saw the third mate toss a package overboard. I told the captain, and he had the package retrieved, and it turned out to contain 10 kilograms of heroin. I'd done that favor for Charlie, and my wife wanted me at home, so in 1958, I became a special hire. Giving up his maritime job wasn't easy. As a seaman, Salvaggi made 3 times as much money as a basic FBN agent. Being married to Siragusa's niece didn't afford him any special privileges either. On the contrary, his fellow agents assumed that Siragusa was helping him behind the scenes, and so they held him to a higher standard. Yet Frank Salvaggi surpassed everyone's expectations. And among his many achievements, he made the historically important case on notorious Joe Valacchi, and pressured the old hood into exposing the mafia's history and hierarchical organization. Sadly, this amazing accomplishment went unacknowledged outside the FBN. More to the point, the FBI deliberately ruined Salvaggi's career because of it, as well as will be explained in a subsequent chapter. My first group leader, Salvaggi recalls, was Angelo Zurco in Group 3. The members of that group were all respected street agents who knew what was going on. Art Mendelsohn was my first partner. Art had been around for years, and he treated me like a kid, as well as Angie Zurlo, who made me read all the files. Ben Fitzgerald had Group 1, although he'd been Fred Dick's partner, and even though he'd walk off a surveillance at dinner time. But Group 1 did okay because of Lenny Schreier. When I arrived, Lenny Schreier was making a lot of cases with an informant he'd inherited from Fred Dick. Then Lenny made the Orlandino case, and when Angie Zurlo retired, Lenny thought he'd get Group 3, and he should have. But Gaffney gave it to John Dolce instead, and that's when the animosity began. Gaffney was a good district supervisor, Salvaggi continues, but he was a square, and he was duped by Pat Ward, just like Don Dolce was poisoned by Patty Biazzi. My own problems with them came during the Controni case. Eddie Smith was going to make John Ormento, and because I was a new guy, they wanted me out of their hair. First they told me to stand in a corner. Then they told me to go up to Harlem and toss some junkies. They weren't supposed to do that, but I didn't know any better, so I went up there alone and got slashed in the leg by a Puerto Rican whore. I wrapped my handkerchief around the gash, went back to the hotel, and asked them what I should do next. They told me to forget about it and avoid the hassle of trying to explain to the bosses what had happened up in Harlem. Salvaggi was trying to fit in. So he did what he was told, but his wife saw the bloody bandage when he got home, and she told her father, and he told Charlie Siragusa, and Siragusa blasted John Dolce for sending Selvaggi into Harlem alone. Inroads into the Mafia. As a rookie agent in late 1958, Frank Selvaggi, along with his senior partner Art Mendelson and veteran NYPD Narcotics Squad Detective Harold Coonan, arrested Helen Street, that's Streat, a heroin addict and prostitute in Harlem. They found 10 ounces of heroin on her during a routine shakedown, and rather than go to jail, she flipped. And based on information Helen provided, Selvaggi and his colleagues made a series of street-level cases that led to John Freeman, a powerful drug trafficker from Louisiana. From his flower shop in Harlem, Freeman supplied drug dealers in Chicago, Detroit, and Los Angeles. Freeman stood at 6'4" and weighed 350 pounds, and he was known in the underworld as Mr. Big. As Selvaggi recalls, when he was arrested, he looked around the room and said, quote, "Anyone talks to the cops has his tongue cut out." Although we didn't know it at the time, Selvaggi added matter-of-factly, quote, "Freeman was supplied by Velaki, and Velaki copped from Sal Rinaldo." The Velaki case, and this is the famous Joe Velaki, or I used to say Valachi, but it's Italian, so I guess I should say Velaki. I'm not really sure how he pronounced it. Valachi, the famous Velaki papers have been published since this incident. The Velaki case developed when Helen Street set up her supplier, Hank Towns, and he flipped and took undercover agent Charlie McDonald to Freeman's runner, a one-eyed gangster from Brooklyn called Slim. Freeman never handled narcotics himself, but instead he had Slim receive the heroin from Joe Velaki's delivery man, and then Slim in turn delivered it to Freeman's customers, including Hank Towns. Freeman had 5 customers, and all 5 were hand-picked because they were ex-cons with records for armed robbery or other gun-related charges. Charlie McDaniel made 2 undercover buys from Slim, each for 100 ounces of heroin. Then, showing tremendous composure, he met alone with Freeman in his flower shop. On this critical occasion, which assured Freeman's conviction, McDonald persuaded Mr. Big to supply him directly, and Freeman unwisely had his son, John Jr., personally deliver 100 ounces of heroin to McDonald. Surveillance conducted during the buys revealed that Ralph Wagner was Velaki's delivery man to Slim, and during a forceful interrogation in which Selvaggi and Jack Brady placed him under extreme duress, Slim revealed that the Italian boss lived in an apartment building with unusual gates in a neighborhood Selvaggi was familiar with in the Bronx. Selvaggi drove around the neighborhood for several days until he found the apartment building. And they discovered that Michael Monica was the plant man holding the heroin for Velaki in his apartment. You caught my eye with the chat room here. I've got it up, and always nice to see you guys in the chat. Thank you so much for participating, and I don't mind if you're way the heck off of topic as long as you're enjoying the conversation. And okay, back to the book. Just a second. So, Corky, you had a Goss in the Revolutionary War that played the fife, and that's fascinating. I wonder if you actually are related, if you had a chance to trace it. And anyway, we may need to have another revolution. So I'll keep that fife handy. Eventually, they saw Joe Velaki enter the building, and they discovered that Michael Monaco was the plant man holding the heroin. But Velaki, Wagner, and Monaco realized they were being watched, and after Freeman was arrested in 1959, they tried to slip out of sight. Velaki hid out in New Rochelle for a while, then moved to a trailer camp in Connecticut. Ralph fled to Mexico and then Texas, where he was arrested. Ralph was returned to New York, and when he was out on bail, we started meeting, unquote. Ralph Wagner, a one-time professional boxer with a bad temper when he got drunk, became Selvaggie's informant. And in November 1959, he provided Selvaggi with the vital information that led to Velaki's arrest. While Velaki was on the lam in the Freeman case, he turned his jukebox concession over to a young hood named Paulie. Paulie would make the rounds, collect the coins, count them up, and then call Velaki and tell him how much money he'd made that week. Wagner knew the number that Paulie called every day around 11 o'clock. He knew it was a payphone off a two-lane highway near Thomaston, Connecticut, but he didn't know the exact location. So Selvaggi, Mendelssohn, and Wagner drove to Thomaston one night. It was a shot in the dark, yes, but they didn't expect to find themselves in the middle of nowhere, driving up and down an unlit road in rural Thomaston, looking for a pay phone booth. Quote, "We'd made 2 swipes," Selvaggi recalls, "then by sheer coincidence Velaki lights a cigarette in the phone booth just as we're passing by. The whole thing lit up and we could see his white hair. We stopped the car and Ralph jumped out. To this day, I have no idea how he got back to New York. We didn't have time to do anything about Ralph running away. So we went to grab Velaki, and as Mendelssohn and I approached the phone booth, he saw us coming. It was a very spooky night, and he thought we were mob guys come to kill him. 'Don't shoot,' he said, as he came out of the booth. Velaki was mine 10 minutes after we grabbed him," Selvaggi says with satisfaction. "We'd been driving all over, up and down the highway, and we were about to run out of gas. So we pulled into a fire station, identified ourselves as federal agents, and while Mendelssohn filled up the car, Velaki and I went inside to take a piss. He was a diabetic, and I agreed to drive back to the trailer park so he could get his pills. After I agreed to do that, he said he wanted to make a deal, but only with me because I was an Italian, and because he thought that Mendelssohn was Jewish. So, Selvaggi shrugs, quote, "Between him thinking that Mendelssohn was Jewish and me agreeing to drive him back for his pills, that's how I became Velaki's case agent." In January 1960, Joe Velaki pled guilty in the Eastern District of New York and was led out of jail with the agreement that prior to sentencing, he'd secure information for the initiation of a major federal narcotics case. After that, quote, "We started going for drives late at night, taking in bars around Westchester County. One night we were having a beer at Foley's in Pleasantville, Velaki's hinky. He's a tough guy, a button man in the Genovese family, so he doesn't want to give anyone up. He tries to put $100 bill in my pocket," Selvaggi scowls. "I told him I give you money. Then I reminded him that he was doing court for sentencing in February and that time was running out. I said I'd delay the proceedings, but only if he gave up Michael Monica as a sign of good faith. So Valaki made an appointment to meet Monica on a street corner in East Harlem at 2 o'clock in the morning. And when Monica climbed out of the cab, I arrested him. He was the last fugitive we picked up in the Freeman case. Rebellion in the Genovese family. With Monica's arrest, Valaki's crew chief Tony Bender, real name Anthony Strollo, sent him and Ralph Wagner to Stefano Magaddino in Buffalo. Bender assured the fugitives that Magaddino, the mafia boss of Upper New York State, was going to smuggle them into Canada. But Wagner had a gut feeling that Bender had actually paid Magaddino to kill them, so he fled to Texas, where he pulled 2 armed robberies and was arrested in March 1960. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 12 years at the Atlanta Penitentiary. Valaki, meanwhile, remained in Buffalo until Bender summoned him back to New York City. Bender told him the fix was in, Selvaggi explains. He said he'd only get 5 years, so Valaki turned himself in to John Enright at the courthouse squad. To understand all this, Selvaggi says, you have to go back to Vito Genovese. Genovese was a classy guy. He'd been convicted on a narcotics rap in 1959, and I met him in Tompkins Square late one night while he was out on bond. I asked him why he didn't skip town. Generals don't run, he said. Then he told me to get a haircut. Joe Adonis was a classy guy, too. When they were in charge, there was no crime in their neighborhoods. But they had a strict code. If you were a made guy like Valaki, you had to adhere to the rules. If you adhere to the rules, no one can slap you. No one can bother your business. No one can mess with your wife. But you have to follow orders. You have to follow the rules that the smart old mustache Pete's put in place to keep button men like Valaki in line. The old bosses knew they couldn't trust the button men, but they needed money makers, so they made the rules. Quote, then Genovese decided that Anastasia had gone too far after he had Scalici killed. That's when Genovese made the rule, quote, no drugs, unquote. But the younger guys didn't want to give up the drugs because it was a good way to make money. So the bosses said, okay, as long as you keep it in Harlem. It's not in our neighborhood, who cares? Now, that's some of the most important stuff in the book, is just to understand that Genovese was the guy that said no drugs, you know. Luciano was all about drugs. But you have a guy that will stand up against the heroin trade in the mafia, and I have to salute that, you know. There's so much bad stuff going on that when we find somebody with a moral character to protect, you know, kids and children from the drugs, as well as protecting their own people, because obviously what happened was the younger guys started sampling the product, and the next thing you know, they're killing each other for the product. And that was as much of the demise of the Sicilian mafia as anything else. So Genovese made a great move, but now you see it's all playing out in our world today, that there's so much money in heroin, fentanyl, opiates generally, that people get killed for it. And, you know, that's the world we're living in today. We have to accept that we are living in a world where opiates are more important than human life. And that's the way it is. Hey, Pete, good to have you. Charles, Guillermo. All right, everybody. Okay, so it's rebellion in the Genovese family. Despite his own rule, Vito Genovese was convicted on drug charges, some say falsely, and that's what set the stage for Joe Valachi's great betrayal. While Genovese was out on appeal, Tony Bender started plotting to take over the family with his top two lieutenants, Vinnie Mauro and Frank Caruso. Mauro and Caruso were vicious hoods, and Valachi was working for them. But he was a disgruntled employee. His godfather was Joe Bonanno, and he was married to the daughter of a powerful mafia don, Giacomo Reina, so Valachi thought that he should have been a boss, not a button man. But Genovese put him in Tony Bender's crew, and then Bender made Vinnie Mauro, not Valachi, his top lieutenant. That hurt because Mauro had been Valachi's protege, and once Bender and Mauro were in charge, they never let Valachi make any money. They gave him about 25 jukeboxes, that's all, and that's how they kept him down, and that's why he dealt narcotics on the side. Ralph told me about Valachi's hassles with Bender and Mauro, Selvaggi explains, and that's how I learned he was a disgruntled employee. Been one for years. Then Genovese lost his appeal and was sent to the Atlanta penitentiary. But he still wanted to run the show. But he knew he couldn't trust Bender. So he sent Tom Eboli to Detroit, where Eboli was inducted into the mafia. After Eboli was made, Genovese named him head of the family, at which point Bender decided he was going to overthrow Eboli. But Bender needed cash to finance the revolution, so his moneymakers, Frank Caruso and Vinnie Mauro, took $500,000 in drug money to the track and lost it all in 2 weeks. And that is when everyone started getting desperate. Like every made man, Joe Valachi paid a percentage of his business profits to his bosses, and they in turn were obligated to support his family if he was imprisoned. But Tom Eboli had no prior relationship with or commitment to Valachi, and when the aging hood surrendered and was no longer productive, Eboli gave his jukebox concession to someone else, leaving Valachi without any means of supporting his family. When Selvaggi heard about this development from Ralph Wagner, he started visiting the vengeful hood at the Federal House of Detention, what FBN agents called West Street, with the intention of exploiting him. He told me he had run out of time before, Selvaggi explains, but he still wanted to make a deal. The meetings we're having at West Street don't look good. A young hood from the Bronx made a remark. Why are you talking to Selvaggi? So he calls me up during the Army-Navy game. The guards bring him down, and he puts on the act. He storms out of the holding cell yelling how I'd set him up. But just before he does that, he whispers a telephone number to me. It's the biggest operation in the city, he says. It's Sal Rinaldo's number, and he thinks it'll help reduce his time. But I already had Rinaldo from another source. Selvaggi shrugs indifferently. What he gave was confirmation, that's all. So in June 1960, Valachi got 15 years in the Freeman case. He was 57, and there was no consideration. Valachi's confirmation, however, was one of the factors that allowed the deputy sheriff in Westchester to put a wiretap on Rinaldo's home. Detectives and FBN agents listened constantly for the next few months until they overheard Matteo Palmieri telling Rinaldo that something big was coming in on a particular ship. He gave the date and location. So Charlie Mack and I, quote, followed Rinaldo up to Pier 84, and that's where Customs Agent Mario Cozzi sees us. He also asks what we're doing there. Selvaggi smiles. There's a war going on with Customs, so I tell him, quote, I'm waiting for my aunt. Then Palmieri shows up and pays off the customs inspector. We watched Palmieri meet Rinaldo, and we saw them load the trunk with the heroin into the back of a bakery van. Gaffney and Ward were with us, and they let Sheriff Hoy and his people bust them up in Yonkers with 10 kilos of pure heroin that had been transported from Italy aboard the Saturnia. Right after the bust, we went back to the machine in New Rochelle, Salvaggi continues. Frank Caruso's calling. He's asking, where's Rinaldo? He's calling Mrs. Rinaldo so she can warn Sal. Next, we searched Rinaldo's house, and Agent Dave Costa found a trap. Inside it was 20 grand and 2 half-kilogram packages of heroin, which meant that Rinaldo had been stealing from his bosses. And once we announced to the press that we'd found the junk at his house, Rinaldo knew he was dead, so he flipped and told us how tons of dope from Turkey passed through labs in France to Sicily, where mafia travel agents got unwitting immigrants to agree to bring along a trunk. The immigrants were on a waiting list, and they would agree to carry the trunk to speed up their paperwork. The trunks had false bottoms, and each one was packed with 10 kilograms of heroin in long, thin packages. They moved over $150 million over 10 years that way. Thanks to Frank Salvaggi, the Rinaldo Palmieri case exposed the mafia's biggest drug smuggling operation in Italy and America. His main informant, Rinaldo, was the plant man, and through Rinaldo the case led to many of New York's major drug dealers, including Saro Mogavero. As recounted in Chapter 9, Mogavero was a former vice president of the ILA, Local 856, and the protege of Rocco Pellegrino, the mafia boss in Westchester. Pellegrino supplied heroin to Joe Civello in Dallas through Mogavero, his contact man to Ormento. Mogavero in 1954 had taken a small fall for Ormento, which allowed the latter to imitate the drug smuggling operation through Cuba that led to Genovese's downfall. A hitman at the age of 15, Saro Mogavero was such a ruthless predator that he forced his childhood friend Salvatore Billy Boy Rinaldo to become his plant man. How he did this is worth recounting. Mogavero knew that Rinaldo loved to gamble, so he persuaded him to borrow money from loan shark Frank Caruso. Mogavero and Caruso knew that Rinaldo would lose the dough, which he did, at which point they made him borrow even more money and then use it to invest in drug shipments with Willie Locasio and Sam Accardi. In order to protect his investment, Rinaldo had no choice but to take the job as plant man. Salvaggi's other major informant, Palmieri, was a baker by trade and the contact man with the Italians. Whenever a shipment arrived, Palmieri would notify Albert Agucci in Buffalo and Vinnie Mauro and Frank Caruso in New York. Palmieri was also responsible for making sure the shipments were safely delivered to Rinaldo. These were things he had done correctly many times before, but it was the smallest mistake on 21st of October 1960 that led to his becoming Salvaggi's reluctant informant. As Salvaggi explains, on the day that we arrested them, Palmieri showed up late at the pier. Palmieri spoke broken English, and because the customs guy couldn't understand him, he wouldn't release the trunk at first. So Palmieri panicked and called Vinnie Mauro, which was something he shouldn't have done. That put Mauro in the case, and Mauro, who was the most vicious of them all, swore he was going to kill Palmieri. And that's why Palmieri flipped and started talking about 43 Italians. Together, he and Rinaldo testified against dozens of people in the U.S. and Italy. They named Mauro Caruso and Salmanieri, a big money man who ran a crap game and had his own sources in Italy, Albert and Vito Agueci, Sam McCarty, the Caneva brothers, Valaki. From their testimony, we developed one conspiracy in Italy and two, including the Frank Borelli case, in New York. Rinaldo, Selvaggi stresses, was a death sentence for everyone. Right away, Eboli puts out a contract on all of these guys. Each one's got a price on his head, but $1 million for anyone who kills Rinaldo. That's when things get rough. A witness in the case, Shorty Holmes, is found stuffed in a garbage can in August. Then, in September, Judge Dimmock reduces a bond on Mauro, Caruso, and Maneri, and they flee, which means that Valaki, who's in jail and can't go anywhere, becomes the main target of the state prosecutor. So now, more than ever, he wants assistance. He's hoping to do the Rinaldo time on top of the Freeman time, but I told him that I already had Rinaldo's number. Cop a plea, I said, or come up with something new. Valaki became incensed. You double-banged me, he yelled. Then he tells me that Mauro, Caruso, and Maneri fled to South America. But we knew that, too. Then Albert Agueci got pissed off at Magaddino. Magaddino got $2,000 for every kilogram Albert brought in, but he wouldn't bail him out of jail. Albert had to mortgage his house. Well, Albert's a badass, so he goes to Magaddino and confronts him. A few days later, they find Albert's body near the Canadian border. He'd been burned with a blowtorch and chunks of flesh had been carved out of his legs. It was gruesome. At which point his brother Vito wants revenge and starts cooperating. So now we have Rinaldo, Palmieri, and Vito Agueci. And that's when Matteo Palmieri and I go up to Buffalo to make a case on Magaddino. As mentioned earlier, Charlie Siragusa had chewed out John Dolce for sending Selvaggi alone into Harlem. For that reason, and because he was Siragusa's son-in-law, one of the Group 3 agents christened Frank with the name Selagusa. That didn't bother him, as it was part of the ribbing that went back and forth in the office. Sal Rinaldo had two other connections, a guy named Shears and a super connection named Mickey Blair. You couldn't get to Blair for less than 5 kilos. He'd been in the Army during the war, and when he was arrested in the Borelli case, he said that General Mark Clark would vouch for him. Selvaggi arched his eyebrows. Anyway, Brady found out that Shears was Sal Maneri, the contact man between the Italians and the French. So we arrested Maneri one night on the street, and during the arrest, I treated his wife with respect, which is why Maneri called me when he got out on bail. Like everyone else in the Rinaldi case, he was on Eboli's hit list and wanted help. So we started meeting in Times Square on Sunday afternoons. Maneri told me things. He says he'll give me a house, meaning a plant, if I can help him. They'll make you a general, he says. Well, Dolce is my group leader, and he knew I was meeting with Maneri. He also knew that Maneri was running a crap game down on the Lower East Side. The next thing I know, Dolce decides he's going to hit Maneri's crap game. Everyone in the group gets an envelope. The way it works, you open the envelope at a prearranged time, and inside is a piece of paper telling you where to meet everyone. But there's no envelope for me. Frank pauses reflectively. Later on, I heard what happened. They're outside Maneri's crap game, and they see him handing something to someone on the street. They think it's a pass, so they hit them right then and there. But it's cash, not drugs. Maneri hands $10,000 to Simac. Not long after that, Maneri flees the country with Mauro and Caruso. Selvaggi lights a cigarette. After that, I requested a transfer to the courthouse squad. Same with the international group. These groups could subpoena their suspects under the 3500 rule. They didn't need dope on the table, and they didn't have to testify in court. And testifying in court was risky business. because slick criminal defense attorneys invariably claimed that the arresting agent had stolen money from or planted evidence on the defendant. I talked to everyone, Salvaggi says with pride. I talked to Genovese. I talked to John Ormento, too. I was in the courtroom when he was sentenced. He was 53 years old and he got 40 years. I was sitting behind him and he turned to me and he said, quote, "It's nothing, kid. I can do it standing up." As any FBN agent will attest, no one had the mafia sources Frank Salvaggi had. But what made him strong also made him vulnerable. I was doing pretty good, Salvaggi says. I'd made Valacchi and Rinaldo, and an 11-kilo case was on Frank Federico. But then I made the mistake of telling Assistant U.S. Attorney John Rosner that I didn't believe that Nelson Cantalopes ever met Vito Genovese. I said that Genovese was the smartest of all the bosses, that he'd made more judges than anyone could ever know, and that there was no way a little 9+ syphilitic Puerto Rican named Nelson Cantalopes could ever get near him. Well, Rosner tells Bill Tendy at the Junk Squad. Tendy is tight with Ward and Dolce, and Tendy tells Dolce that I called Genovese the frame of the century. Tendy tells Dolce, and Dolce tells Enright, who's my boss at the courthouse squad. And now they both want me out. Luciano's luck runs out. While tensions were mounting among the case-making agents in the New York office, the Italian police were doing their part to find 3 of the fugitives in the Rinaldo Palmieri case. They had seen an American couple, Henry and Teresa Rubino, visiting Lucky Luciano in Naples. Something about the Rubinos aroused their suspicions, so they told Hank Manfredi, and at his request they tailed the couple to the border of Spain. Spanish officials picked up the trail and followed them to a meeting with Vinnie Mauro and Frank Caruso. On the 14th of January 1962, FBI agents arrested Mauro and Caruso in Barcelona and Sal Manieri in Majorca. The next day, in an attempt to curry favor from the FBI, Mauro called Luciano, and over Lucky's futile protestations, he explicitly mentioned drugs. The FBI was listening in, of course, and 1 week later, the Italian police summoned Luciano for questioning about his conversation with Mauro. During the interrogation, Hank Manfredi taunted the once powerful boss of bosses. Complaining of heart palpitations, Luciano was released and proceeded under police escort to the Naples airport to meet Martin Gosch, a writer with whom he was co-authoring an exposé. Martin Gosch. As Gosch stepped off the plane, Luciano reached to shake his hand, and then collapsed on the tarmac and died of a massive heart attack. 30 minutes later, Deputy Commissioner Henry Giordano, quote, revealed that the FBN had been on the point of arresting the powerful mafioso for having introduced $150 million worth of heroin to American territory over the previous 10 years. It's unbelievable that the FBN had decided to label Luciano as the mastermind of the Rinaldo Palmieri ring on the basis of a phone call from Vinnie Mauro. And it's incredibly uncanny that Luciano died half an hour before his arrest. It is an unlikely sequence of events that suggests that this was not death by natural causes. But the FBN would not have killed him. For over a decade, he'd been a source on numerous drug traffickers, and during that time, Harry Anslinger had shamelessly exploited him for publicity purposes. But Anslinger was on the verge of retirement, and perhaps Giordano felt that the bête noire had outlived his purpose. Or perhaps, as Salvicini claims, the CIA was afraid of what Luciano might say if he was put on trial. The CIA knew that Luciano was concerned about his heart condition and that American mobsters routinely sent vitamins to him in Naples. According to Vizzini, the CIA simply intercepted a delivery and substituted identical pills laced with an untraceable poison. That particular conspiracy theory will never be proven, but two things are perfectly clear. Despite the myth that Lucky Luciano controlled international drug trafficking, the illegal movement of narcotics did not abate with his death, and once Anslinger had handed over the organizational reins to hapless Harry Giordano, the FBN could no longer defend itself from its arch-bureaucratic rival J. Edgar Hoover. The FBI director moved in for the kill, and Lucky had the last laugh in hell. Well, that's the end of chapter 16 and the end of Lucky Luciano. As we learned from the church hearings, the CIA has a heart attack gun. They can just aim it at you, I guess, and suddenly you have a heart attack. They, of course, also would know all the proper pills from their health alteration committee, what to use to make it look like a natural heart attack. Well, these are experts at this stuff, and, that kind of expertise in killing is part of the trade of the CIA. I'm going to talk to you guys tonight. I'm going to do a minefields, and I'm looking forward very much to that. I'm going to spend the afternoon preparing for it, so I hope that you can join me tonight at 8 p.m. for a special edition of McDuff's Minefields. Hey, make sure and watch Harley Schlanger's recorded yesterday at larouchepack.com. His broadcast yesterday is very, very important. So that's my recommendation to everyone, is to make sure and follow Harley Schlanger at larouchepack.com. And the October 29th show yesterday is really important.